Thank you, Craig. Please hold your applause. No, I should have said, please sit down and hold your applause. We're going to talk today about probably one of the most depressing subjects in anti-money laundering compliance, the proliferation financing of weapons of mass destruction. Chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. This is the sort of stuff that keeps people awake who work in financial institutions, the intelligence community, banking regulators, the military, law enforcement. This is the subject that causes people to think. Now, what are we talking about here? Here's a schematic for Little Boy, which was dropped onto Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The schematic shows the different components, different systems, and it's a gun model, which means you take highly enriched uranium, fire with using an explosive, a conventional explosive, and smash it into another pile of highly enriched uranium, thereby creating a chain reaction and therefore a nuclear fission explosion as opposed to a fusion explosion, which is very different. Uranium naturally occurs at a purity level of 0.7%. The trick is to enrich it into highly enriched uranium gas for a fission bomb, and you have to get it around 90%. And these cascades, the silver objects, they're the ones that enrich uranium gas as they move from centrifuge to centrifuge to centrifuge. The one that exploded over Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, that's 15,000 tons of TNT. The largest nuclear explosion created by man was 50 megatons, so that's a lot, and that was the Tsar bomba exploded by the Russians. And in those cascades are multiple components, one of which are ceramic magnets. The cascades spin around at thousands of RPM, and those ceramic magnets are crucial in order for the cascade to spin at such high speed. The magnets are classified as dual-use goods. So when you see strange things classified as dual-use goods, you can say, well, I know what ceramic magnets are. They're involved in the production of highly enriched uranium. But there's a whole list of dual-use goods, which look seemingly innocuous, but when you dig down, you realize that they're an integral component of producing highly enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon. And if you want to learn how to build a nuclear weapon, don't come to me. Go to the United States Senate, because in 2002, in a hearing entitled Dirty Bombs and Basement Nukes, the Terrorist Nuclear Threat, you can learn everything you want to know about building a nuclear weapon. It's not that complicated. Remember, the first ones were designed and produced in the 30s, a whole series of physicists. My father was a physicist at the University of Toronto, and this is where I learned about this sort of thing. He would tell me these stories, and I'd stay up late at night worrying if we're all going to die. But that's why I ended up walking down this path. And this testimony, which you can download, provides a tremendous wealth of information on the realistic parameters around a nuclear threat or a radiological threat. So this is not new. This is very old. Threat actors, in order to acquire a weapon of mass destruction, can buy it, they can build it, they can have it gifted to them, or they can steal it. The definition of proliferation financing, FATF has produced its own definition, but there are, of course, other definitions. Effectively ignore that debate. Proliferation financing is about financing weapons of mass destruction. That's it, pure and simple. And the whole point of proliferation financing is camouflage. As a party involved in either gifting, buying, renting, building a nuclear weapon, I need to camouflage my transactions around the world in sourcing components and selling components, in sourcing complete weapon systems and selling complete weapon systems. I need that camouflage that works within today's global financial system. And that camouflage is incredibly powerful when it comes time to proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. That is the most important point. Complex proliferation financing schemes depend on several things, including enlisting intermediaries to evade sanctions. Intermediaries, well, lawyers, accountants, bankers? No, that would never happen. Obscuring financial beneficial ownership, that's a given. BOI, obscurity, comes up time and time again for not just proliferation financing, but for terrorist financing, money laundering, sanctions evasion, et cetera. And then new virtual assets. Virtual assets can help with smaller component systems, but for larger systems, it does get a bit obvious. And then exploiting the maritime and shipping sectors. The professionals are either opportunistic money launderers, professional money launderers, professional financiers of proliferation financing, yes, that is a job description, state actors, such as banks, industry, and civil service, which are owned or operated or influenced by the state, the intelligence agencies that work for various countries, and so the offshore environment is no longer tropical. The offshore environment you have to think about for proliferation financing is anywhere, because camouflage enables individuals to work as if they were dealing with offshore financial centers. Threat actors. Well, look at these smiling men. Aren't they happy? What a lovely crew of characters. The gentleman on the left is Abdul Qadir Khan, the father of the Pakistani nuclear program and one of the greatest proliferators of weapons of mass destruction in human history. Unfortunately, he passed away recently. Then there's Bashar al-Assad, who used to use chemical weapons on a civilian population. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, president of Iran, famous for kickstarting the Iranian nuclear program. Saddam Hussein, well, don't we all know him? Gassing the Kurds. And then the man himself on a white horse. The greatest purveyor of proliferation financing and weapons systems alive today. There are many high-risk countries. This is not a definitive list. This is a list of possible countries, because for proliferation financing, you can have countries where correspondent banking transactions are run through, which is where we are right now. That's where USD is cleared. So is this a proliferation finance area of concern? I would think so. Does it mean everyone involved is, dirty? No, of course not, but it's something to think about. Russia, Iran, North Korea, China, Syria, Pakistan, Malaysia, Cambodia, all of these countries have areas of concern for not just the PF side of things, but camouflage in general. And that's the way to look at it. If there is the opportunity for the camouflaging of financial transactions, there is the opportunity for PF. And that's where you have to erect those defenses. The role of trade-based money laundering. TBML has been around for ages. I mean, my firm's been providing training on it since 2007. I was, in fact, one of the advisors, well, the only advisor to the two Canadian economists who wrote the TBML white paper for the FATF in 2006. And TBML is very useful for PF because it allows for large sums. I can use a standby letter of credit to send from one jurisdiction to another, tens of millions of dollars. None of it goes through MT 103 or 202 COV. It all goes through a 202 or 205 financial institution to financial institution. So that means TBML is best suited for the large value transactions associated with selling either complete or components of weapons of mass destruction. And getting it across borders, nicely camouflaged, under invoicing, mislabeled goods, standby LCs, all these TBML aspects, PF comes into its own. So, actually, I just described that. The one thing I didn't describe was phantom or ghost shipments or false description of goods. So you can run through a TBML scenario that looks like narcotics trafficking. And you can peel back the layers, and then you'll see a few things that don't make sense. And then the ugly head of PF can rear its head. So it's not as if you have enough compliance problems to begin with, and then some idiot like me stands up on stage and says, oh, by the way, you should consider the PF angle as well. Sorry, my apologies, but that's today's reality. And don't forget, tomorrow is the expiry of the last nuclear control treaty between Russia and the United States. After tomorrow, there are none. So it's open season. We can start building them up again. We can start producing weapons of mass destruction all over again. This is a problem that's not going to go away. Correspondent banking. Well, I mean, there you go. Correspondent banking, TBML, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Those areas, those parts of international banking are where PF risk really rears its head. The FATF has issued its usual edict saying PF networks target financial institutions in third countries which are seeking to take advantage of jurisdictional differences, blah, 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 blah. Camouflage. Camouflage, camouflage, camouflage. If it's jurisdictional arbitrage, if it's beneficial ownership information, if it's all these different bits and pieces, the end goal is camouflaging a transaction. And if you're Pablo Escobar, you have certain resources. If you're El Chapo Guzman, you have certain resources. But what if you're a state intelligence service who has access to state banks to assist in the camouflage of the transactions for either the export or the import of components or complete systems? That's a level of camouflage that goes above and beyond, introductory AML. That's where things get very much advanced. Economic sanctions is one of the primary tools used to combat proliferation financing. And does it work? Because I'm looking at what's happening in Russia, I'm looking at Iran, I'm looking at North Korea, and they're still functioning. They're being hit with all sorts of economic sanctions. And that tempo seems to be ebbing and flowing as time goes on. And you have to have economic sanctions, it makes sense, but is that a magic bullet? And the answer is no. Defenses against proliferation financing depend upon financial institutions running a risk-based approach to compliance, not just for AML, but for TF and PF, and regulators and financial intelligence units themselves, and then the Economic Sanctions Administration. It's an entire concert of instruments. Sometimes they're playing in harmony. Sometimes it's like walking into the room and the orchestra is just warming up and it's just one massive wall of sound. It can get very confusing. But you can have comprehensive sanctions, targeted sanctions, sectoral sanctions, secondary sanctions. You can have purple sanctions, orange sanctions. It all depends on whether it's coupled with other efforts. And those other efforts of paramount importance. Dual-use goods. We talked about ceramic magnets. I don't know if this qualifies as a weapon of mass destruction, but it could certainly destroy something. What if you smacked some radioactive material next to that and built a radiological weapon? Dual-use goods are a real headache because it just becomes so complex to track what is officially classified as dual use and what is not. I walked the floor of a trade finance operation a few years ago, and I said to one of the trade processing clerks, well, where do you get your information on what is a dual use good or not? And he goes, well, we look it up. I said, what do you look it up in? Well, Wikipedia. And I said, really? And he goes, yeah. And I said, okay. So I told the head of trade operations, you might want to give them a different source of information. Wikipedia is all open source. You might want to try something else. Like if they're looking up sodium perchlorate, they need to know that's a component, a propellant in a missile. Sodium perchlorate sounds like a food additive, but it can be a component of a WMD system. So accessing reliable information on PF dual-use goods is of critical importance. That's pointing out the patently obvious, I know. But if you dig into operations within a payment center or trade finance operations, and you actually sit on the floor and ask people, well, how do you know? What are you using as tools? You might end up with some very surprising answers. Complexity of international supply chains. 5 primary categories of geographical PF. Countries of concern, source material geographies, funding geographies, transshipment geographies, enabling geographies. In other words, the world, right? If you're going through as a camouflage PF operator who is trying to get materials from point A to point B, you're going to take any route you can, and chances are you're going to be pretty well resourced in that process, and you'll have a lot of options ahead of you. The drug cartels, years and years ago, would build fiberglass semi-submersible submarines and send them across the Pacific from Latin America into Mexico, where they'd unload tons of narcotics. Then they started hiring former Soviet Union submarine manufacturer engineers who would build homemade submarines with conning towers and periscopes with FLIR, forward-looking infrared, with 10-ton payloads. Now the Europeans are picking up self-propelled semi-submersibles going across the Atlantic Ocean. Could you imagine getting that job? I don't think they have dental. And I've learned recently that the drug cartels previously would scuttle the vessel because the profits were so huge. But the price of cocaine, because of the increased supply, because it's, everywhere, is so much that now the drug cartels are saying to the crews, okay, you drove it over there, and that sucked. Now drive it back, we need to reuse it. So this is the type of logistics that surrounds international narcotics trafficking. Think of what is available to a proliferation financing network when you add the ability to work with specific national security services and intelligence services or military. And then you end up with a whole cornucopia of opportunity. So for trends, deceptive shipping practices. So this is coming up in economic sanctions time and time again. Boats switch off the AIS, the automatic identification system. One day they're in Venezuela, the next day they're in, just off the coast of India. Either they have 1,500 Evinrude outboards in the back of the boat propelling them across the ocean at high speed, or they're spoofing the signal. It's becoming difficult to tell what's real and what's not. And with the advent of auto-generative AI and shipping documentation and all of the associated documentation, you have a real opportunity to create an entire fake world and to move into phantom shipments where you can run an entire ghost fleet. Inside that network, not only is the opportunity there for trafficking of international narcotics or standard weapon systems, but within that network, if you bribe the right people, if you scratch the right itches, you have an opportunity for proliferation financing as well. So what I'm trying to say to you is that none of this is new. The magic bullet of combating PF is not such and such piece of technology. You press a button and all your problems are solved. This is an enhancement of an existing problem of what is effectively smuggling and money laundering, but with systems that do real damage. Within the law enforcement community, there's this phrase of being left or right of boom. Boom is when something has gone boom. Being left of boom is in the preemptive phase. That's the phase where people work together and coordinate. You report suspicious transactions. It floats up into the National Financial Intelligence Unit in any jurisdiction, and then it's acted upon by the authorities. Being right of boom in a terrorist event, such as September 11th in this vicinity, or the July 7/7 bombings in London, or any number of terrorist events, being right of boom means you're looking at a smoking crater. and people have been killed and murdered, and that's awful. But being right of boom in the event of a proliferation of weapons of mass destruction event, that's a different category of risk. I'm not sure we can afford to be right of boom there. So we better work very hard to be left of boom. Other trends include circuitous routes, not just for the vessels, but for money. Not just for money, but for value. The circuitous routes betray terrorist financing and PF to the authorities. It makes sense. If there's no real reason behind it, what could this be? Transshipment centers, free trade zones, these are the Wild West in many jurisdictions for international trade, where certain rules apply and certain rules don't apply. You can have a free trade zone operating in one country that doesn't subscribe to the criminal code of the country that surrounds it, where the rules can be very different. The influence of major players in that environment can be very different, and law enforcement priorities can be very different. So transshipment centers, free trade zones, not just hotbeds for money laundering and terrorist financing, but also for proliferation financing. And the use of intelligence community assets from hostile nations. By the way, I think you're supposed to ask me questions, aren't you? Because something's supposed to pop up there. Nothing yet. Means I've answered everything, which is great. Let's keep it that way. The intelligence community from hostile nations. It's one thing to go against Pablo Escobar's accountants and his businessmen and his retired former bankers, not current. That would never happen. And they have a certain amount of money and a certain amount of resourcing, and their number one motive is profit. But it's another thing entirely to go against an intelligence community with state actors who want to push proliferation financing to fulfill, well, in the case of most nations, a political agenda. In the case of Abdul Qadir Khan, a political agenda plus the ability for him to make massive amounts of money for him personally. So that's a very different foe. And that foe has the ability to exert much more intense levels of camouflage, meaning the suspicious activity reporting by a financial institution has to respond in a sophisticated way. Otherwise, it's going to go right over your head. An escalation of consequences due to fentanyl trafficking. This is the new one. Fentanyl is now a weapon of mass destruction. It's no longer a narcotics law enforcement problem. It's now a national security failure. It's a chemical weapon. The profits are massive. Talk to anyone in the Drug Enforcement Administration about fentanyl smuggling over the southern border in the United States, and it goes like this. Well, there's a whole bunch of guys, they got a whole bunch of fentanyl, and the coordinators of the smuggling operation say to their mules, or their smugglers, all right, 3, 2, 1, go. And they just go for it. They send vehicles, trucks, ships, what have you. And if 90% of them fail and 10% get through, that 10% is pure profit. Cost-income ratio for fentanyl in terms of production is, I don't know, 1, 2, 3%. Those are pretty hefty margins. So if you lose a whole bunch of attempted shipments to get into your target country, so what? With those profits come the ability for many people to say, right, well, I'm in. This is fantastic. But demand doesn't change, only life expectancy of the consumers. And one of the, I'll give you a piece of advice here for free, which is if you ever decide to become a major narcotics trafficker, don't forget, you can't kill your market. If fentanyl is too powerful and your users take it and start dropping like flies, that's bad for business. So you gotta be careful, okay? Regulatory consequences, it's one thing to get caught for narcotics trafficking. And banks, time and time again, get embroiled in narcotics investigations. And those investigations come up because either DEA or FBI have informed FinCEN or OCC or NYDFS that they've just busted a massive money laundering op, and well, what do you know? This bank was knee-deep in the trough. It's not just a question of getting discovered because of regulatory failure. Banks run the risk of becoming exposed because law enforcement has surfaced the fact that they were knee-deep in it, and maybe they knew about it, maybe they didn't. Just ask Wachovia about that, you know? So the regulatory consequences of narcotics trafficking are one thing, but what are the regulatory consequences for a failure to grasp a WMD concern? They could be much more substantial. So your compliance lapses now become national security threats. How's that for keeping you awake at night? How am I doing for keeping you awake at night? Is it going well? Yeah. And then you have reputational risk damage. It's one thing to be labeled as a drug trafficking bank that enabled all sorts of narcotics to come through the state of New Jersey and the state of New York. Not that I'm mentioning anyone in particular. But what if that now is elevated to, well, yeah, you enabled $400 million in fentanyl trafficking, and that's now a national security risk. That is now a national security threat, and the consequences just go up from there. So what previously was a multi-billion-dollar fine, which is great, because who pays that? Shareholders. Oh, well. But now individuals can get called up. Your actions led to a failure in a chemical weapon being deployed in our country. Your actions. So do you walk out in handcuffs? Is that the next level for this? I don't know. We'll see. Remember what I said about keeping you awake at night? Question. Is the point of getting a WMD to make it go boom or to extort money from threatened countries? Well, WMD is going boom. Shinrikyo in Tokyo unleashed sarin gas in the Tokyo metro system, killed a whole bunch of people. There was no blackmail, there was no money attempt. Bashar al-Assad, he still is, he lives in Moscow. He used to drop barrel bombs out of helicopters using conventional explosives, which would force the civilian population to seek shelter in bomb raid shelters in the basements of apartment buildings in urban centers in Syria. And then once they'd sought shelter, that's when the chemical weapons would be deployed, because chlorine gas is heavier than air, and it comes down the stairs and settles in the basement, and that's the best way of using it. So you're not trying to make money off it. You're proving a point, or you're killing what you perceive to be your opponent. It's not about blackmail. It's actual deployment to prove a political point. And which regulators govern banks about WMD? I think hopefully all of them, right? And current transshipment centers for WMD, what are the current transshipment centers? Just like money laundering, they don't produce an annual report. So I can't open it up and go, well, that's a last quarter. It's transshipment centers as a tool for use for the purposes of smuggling either components or complete systems. And it will vary with application. So, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. The image from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the far left is the amount of heroin it takes to kill you. Heroin, a derivative of opium, and goes through a refining process. That's a substantial chunk relative to, on the far right, that's the equivalent amount of fentanyl it takes to kill you. And in the middle is carfentanil, more lethal than fentanyl. It gets better and better, doesn't it? So imagine if that's the amount of carfentanil and fentanyl it takes to kill you, how many people can I waste with this? That is a fentanyl shipment. So when you're talking about sending massive amounts of chemical weapons into a country, these are the sorts of busts that are being accomplished by DEA, Border Patrol, FBI, and not just in this country, all around the world. That's a big deal. Because if you're the bank that ends up in transactions associated with that much death on a table, chances are the news is not going to be good about you. Can I explain professional money launderers? Professionals who launder money. What resources can you recommend for dual-use good research? Not Wikipedia. That's all I'm going to say. There are a lot of providers on this. I'm sure you're getting bombarded over email every day about it. Just don't let your trade operations or payment operations use Wikipedia. I'd go so far as go to the IT people and say bar access to it from any company browser. Solutions. Technology plays a role, without a doubt. You can't manage all of the associated information and research necessarily combat PF without the advent of technology. That's a given. But automation alone will not be effective. You have to examine the human element. The awareness should be that there's anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing, and proliferation financing, the three pillars of financial crime within a financial institution. Sanctions plays a role across all of that. Corruption plays a role all across that, of course. But those are the three categories. Previously, it was just AML and terrorist financing. Not anymore. You need education, you need expertise, and time sensitivity. If there's the indication of any sort of PF involved, you have to have a well-executed plan to make sure this information gets into the National Financial Intelligence Unit of any jurisdiction involved ASAP. You can't wait. You need to be left of boom. If you pause, if you wait, you might end up being right of boom, and that's not good enough. Remember, there has to be a sixth sense about suspicion and transactions. Ask any intelligence service about the most poignant pieces of information they receive from financial institutions regarding terrorist financing, and most of them, I will say most of them, will come back and say some of the best financial intelligence we received from a bank was originally labeled as money laundering and came to us as money laundering. Searching for terrorist financing as a bank can be a false goal because you don't have access to the same information that the intelligence services have. Searching for suspicious activity is what you need to do. You need to report suspicious activity, whether it's related to money laundering, terrorist financing, PF, or what have you, doesn't matter. Leave it to the professionals to piece it all together. You need to report suspicious employee activity. There are certain countries who use bank employees to further their goals in terms of national security operations that they see as being a top priority. That's something financial institutions need to wake up more to. Embed within the financial intelligence unit and the line of business proliferation financing awareness. Enable an action plan if revealed. Don't just say, who do we call? What number? No, you need to know this in advance. Who's this? Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer in 1947 was standing in front of a Senate describing the effects of nuclear weapons, and a senator turned to him and said, what's to prevent someone from driving a nuclear bomb into Midtown Manhattan? What do we do to defend against that? What do we need? And his response? A screwdriver. Because you have to open every crate, every box, disassemble every vehicle as it makes its way to Midtown. That's how you get 100% success. That was 1947. Let me check my watch. That was a while ago. It's 2026. Is the problem changed? Let's put that in a survey. Has the problem changed? No, it hasn't. Manchester CF, my firm, has been producing proliferation financing training for years. This course is now available through BAFT as the Advanced Financial Crime Series. You can get this individual module. This is the digital textbook. It's 50,000 words. There's nothing like it in the marketplace today. And that course forms part of the certificate in financial crime and trade. And then The certificate in transaction banking compliance, which is also from Manchester CF Content, includes one component on proliferation financing. Educational awareness will save you from being eaten by the wolves alongside technology solutions. But if you're just relying on a computer to go beep and fix all your problems, you're dead in the water. It's influencing the human element. I met a guy with 48 years experience in trade finance in Manchester in the UK. That's the record I've found so far, 48. Can anyone beat that? No? Try and get something past him, because when he does the smell test, chances are he smells a rat. It's going to be really hard saying to someone like that, my camouflage might be pretty good. That same level of approach has to pervade trade operations, payment center. That's the operational side of things. But then you have the client relationship management side of things. I worked in Hong Kong for Standard Chartered Bank, in the 90s. And in my corporate banking portfolio, I think I can say this now because statute of limitations has expired. And that is because we had a corporate client who the father, the head of the Taipan, the head of the Hong family business, he'd come over from China with nothing, it's like Li Ka-shing, built a company from nothing. And he was such a nice man. He was about 90 years old when I first met him. And he had built this company from nothing. They were listed in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. They were in the textiles and garments business. They were brilliant. He was brilliant. He used to have on his letterhead the company logo on the bottom, proudly banked by Standard Chartered Bank. There was a sense of pride in doing business with this man. He was so old school, and I adored him. And he had two sons. One son who took over, who was just as brilliant as the father, and the other one. And the other one had a gambling problem. And the other one was hungover every time I saw him. And he was just a dirtbag. And we found out he was being manipulated by the triads because his gambling debts got a little high, just like him. And so the father's name, brand, and reputation, where all the compliance people would look at that company and say, what could possibly go wrong with that company? Nothing. They're just brilliant. And me and two others knew that that idiot son was just killing them. And I left corporate banking, got into institutional banking, never found out what happened, courtesy of the idiot son. But that's who you gotta worry about. You have to worry about that your assumptions on things like proliferation financing going into these types of transactions might be wrong. Might be wrong. You have to worry about is on whether or not you're operating on the best information, and you have to worry about whether your network of people has that sixth sense to look at the camouflage needed for total PF systems and say, we're going to put our best foot forward and do what we can to stay left of boom. Questions?
We've got a couple of minutes. We have a coup.
Right. How far behind the bad actors are the regulators on PF? Well, the problem with the statement regulators on PF looks at all banking regulators and all financial intelligence around the world. And some of them are really good, and some of them are not so good. So you have to make a jurisdiction statement on whether or not certain jurisdictions have a grip on what PF is all about. And I think we know the answer to that is no. Our last session was about AI. Is the role of AI growing and it is considered dependable? For PF? AI and PF, what could go wrong? Remember what I said? If you're relying on pressing a button to fix all your problems, you're dead in the water. There's your answer. From a reputational risk perspective, should US banks help with trade finance of military-grade weapons? Just out of curiosity, what sort of weapon is not military grade? No, and I'm not going to answer that. That's not a question that makes sense. Trade finance to do with American companies or foreign companies that have permitted licenses and export permits, you do business with them. They've been vetted, they've gone through a process, you have every expectation of conducting trade finance transactions with them. If they're run by a gentleman who's very good at what he does and he has an idiot son, I would have second thoughts.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.